Stability, an autoethnographic essay and artist statement. A note on language, and a note on this note on language, because the recording version will differ. The note on language in the essay portion discusses which words I capitalize and which words I don't. Specifically, I mention Black, Indian, and other, but I do not capitalize white. And this was an intentional choice in line with the Columbia Journalism Review, as they describe how proper nouns for groups describe a shared sense of identity and community. Well, throughout this piece, written and spoken, I'm going to be outlining how whiteness doesn't have this shared sense of identity, outside of contrasting itself against another of its own creation. But I also wanted to include this note on language because I think that it foregrounds what I'll be discussing here. So, while I speak of whiteness as a group or dynamic of power that one can be part of or proximal to, whiteness is not a stable identity, but one that has morphed in the interests of power. And while I agree with critiques that not capitalizing the W of whiteness has the potential to position whiteness as neutral, my choice of lowercase whiteness is not to make it invisible, but instead is an extension of futuring, reflecting the hope of decentering whiteness by recentering what it others, following a process that's been outlined by disability scholars. A 2016 paper by Goodley and team explores this dynamic with the shifting capitalization of disability. And this is an excerpt from page 213. Disability is both centralized and decentralized. Disability is centered when it calls for assemblages and connections with others. Disability demands interdependency. As the assemblage grows, so disability loses its importance. It becomes decentered. The flows of connections and networks erase the original disability subject and replace it with a complex rhizomatic web of relationships. And again, that was page 213. Dismantling whiteness is an ongoing process of dismantling systems of power and extraction. Capital W whiteness demands the center, pushing everyone else to the margins, while also enforcing marginalization along ability, sex, and gender within the center, a scaffolded hierarchy within a hierarchy. By recentering the margins, my aim is to decenter whiteness by placing it within context without erasing it or making it invisible. In the paper, I've included annotations where authors that I quote use the capitalized W in an effort to show this shifting context. Section 1. What does it mean to hold a shape? There's two pieces of media I wish I could find. The first is of myself at 4 years old, my debut as a tap ballet dancer. I can still feel the pink polyester ruches and ribbons, smell the hairspray and lipstick. This was the first and last time that I danced on a stage, in a group, in a knockoff of The Little Mermaid. We were in Missouri for the year, right after my younger sibling was born. We lived in a bungalow backing onto the forest, the basement filled with toys, and an old wooden rocking horse to keep us occupied during tornado warnings. The only indoor offering for girls in the blistering summertime was dance. My mother, looking after a newborn, was trying to keep me away from the scorpions and tarantulas in our backyard. She recounts in the late 90s that the other dance mothers suggested putting me on a diet. In my teens, when we got satellite TV for the first time, my mother and sibling would watch TLC, which included shows like Dance Moms and Toddlers and Tiaras. I'd remember those rooms behind the stage and the very specific type of femininity enforced at such a young age, when the comfort of air conditioning was tied to false lashes and sequined outfits. Years later, while working in food service, running popcorn stands and franchise cafes, I started to recognize what I now know as discipline. There were set soundtracks that corporate sent out, which slowly changed from lo-fi cafe beats to higher BPMs. The speakers pointed toward the workers. On one hand, I assumed this was to make the space comfortable enough for patrons to sit down, but not to stay. The music was timed to keep workers on task. And maybe that's why people like bringing their works to cafes. There's a clear working rhythm that the space reinforces. You steam milk and pump syrup to the beat, conveniently also counted by LED clocks near the drive-through window. I thought back to holding the bar, counting and bending to the beat. Learning ballet was a lot like the learning I would do for the rest of my life, where complexity was broken down into repeatable steps. The image of dance or food service or femininity was a performance. Perfection, in this sense, existed. It was a matter purely of technique and discipline. Plato's ideal from the realm of forms cast a shadow down that I could shape myself to fill. This perfection always came from the outside, so not only was this external expectation internalized, but along with it came the gaze, replacing what it felt like. Van de Linder's exploration of scientific control and ballet outlines the ballets of Balanchine and Stravinsky, who expressed the common difficulty of having to use intermediaries, dancers and musicians, to interpret their creations. And that's from page 1441. To actualize their vision of reality, they set the goals and the process for achieving those goals, in the way an assembly line worker is dictated the method for a specific placement of a bolt, or a barista is told the correct method of making an iced latte. No variations are allowed. There may be many ways to dance, build a car, or make a coffee cold, but the imposition of a correct, measurable way constrains reality and potentiality. Judith Butler's 1999 exploration of performativity asserts that identities are not fixed or innate characteristics, but instead are socially constructed within the constraints of culture and institutions. Similarly, Sullivan in 2003 troubles the idea of the individual, since it's not the individual who performs, but performativity refers to the process through which the subject is constituted. On page 89. The artifice or performance of ballet was more important than my embodied personal experience of ballet. More so, the audience's embodied enjoyment was conflated with this artifice. A misstep could ruin the experience. Section 2. Self-monitoring. Ballet and Taylorism. The connection between assembly lines and ballet went much deeper for me. Van de Linder notes that Balanchine characterized his work as a carpenter choreographer, selecting performers with intrinsic qualities such as height and slimness, as well as the potential to be trained, as though he was searching for the pieces to assemble a cabinet. But Balanchine also made the connection to technologies, that ballet is not a chest of drawers. It is closer to an IBM electronic computer. It is a machine, but a machine that thinks, a measured construction in space demonstrated by moving bodies. And that is quoted in Van de Linder, page 1447. By a machine that thinks, Balanchine's description reminds me of today's human-computer relationships, especially artificial intelligence. While it can be tempting to think about computers as having the capability to think, their thoughts are constrained by the views of the programmers. In a similar fashion, Balanchine's performers did not think or truly have autonomy. Instead, Balanchine was connecting technology, performance, and scientific management. The dancers were pieces to act out his thinking. Movements were broken down into routines and habits. Ballet was not a form of self-expression on the part of the dancer, but the director's representation, demonstrated by moving bodies with absent minds. The director or manager was allowed to think and direct, while the bodies of the performers were mechanized and dehumanized to that end. Management principles in dance can be mapped onto the practices of work, where the image takes precedence over the experience, as the experience is theorized to come through proper performance of the image. Starbucks training unofficially included how to make small talk. Coworkers shared their use of questions that wouldn't lead to trauma dumping from patrons. Open-ended questions that weren't too open. These were techniques of both engaging in and protecting ourselves from engaging in too much emotional labor. keeping to the time allotted per customer without making the interaction appear mechanical, a performance of authenticity. Taylorism, a method of scientific management, arose through methods of control placed on artisans as they began to gather and share in larger groups. Bornfeldt's 2023 publication maps the trajectories surrounding Taylorism, beginning from its precursor, artisanship, where the production process and end result was dependent on the artisan. Artisans may be part of a guild that shares techniques and equipment, their skills and quality partially managed through apprenticeship, but each person had their own flair and left a literal engraved mark on the product so it could be identified as theirs. Taylorism was inspired by military organization models, imposing systematic soldiering. To be a manager, then, was a similar role to a general, taking a bird's-eye view to dispassionately survey the terrain, moving around soldiers and equipment as needed toward a strategic win. Henry Ford of the motor company that bears his name was inspired by the de-assembly lines of the meatpacking industry, and the contribution that highlights the change from Taylorism to Fordism is that of the assembly line to mass-produce cars. Instead of mechanizing worker movements, the work was mechanized as much as possible, and the workers handled the machines. The work did not require any qualifications, as the tasks were very simple and repetitive. This de-skilling, through the addition of technology, led to a fast-paced and monotonous environment with high turnover, but the financial success of mass production meant that workers didn't have any other options. Self-monitoring was no longer connected to setting goals for oneself, but monitoring oneself within the context of the goals of power. This disillusionment of seeing this pattern across my work, hobbies, and school led me to drop out of my undergrad. When I came back with a focus on studying labor and political philosophy, I needed to understand how this widespread rationale had become invisible. The idea of organizing labor toward a set goal wasn't in itself harmful, but alongside fiduciary interests and the requirement of constant productivity across fewer paid bodies, control and surveillance increased, from managers listening in on headsets to virtual proctoring and grading software. Section 2. Holding a Pose. Technologies of White Femininity. A therapist recommended yoga. Maybe I could turn my brain off for a bit and get back inside of myself. Take my mind off the larger crushing systems and breathe. This brings me to the second piece of media that I wish I could find. The article that started me down this thinking on a winter evening about 5 years ago. It was a blog post from someone I'd never heard of who discussed their worries about yoga as a form of control, somehow both eschewing and replicating colonialism within their intention to critique it. That yoga was about internalizing someone else's shapes, giving control to someone else to dictate your shape. When learning about yoga, algorithms at the time brought me to Yoga Journal. Lululemon was advertised on the front page, and the butt-enhancing leggings called back to the Asana-inspired, fat-burning workouts I'd seen in 17 magazine. It was absurd to me then, and now, that practices of stretching, breathing, and finding peace were racialized and othered, while being sold primarily by white men. Bell Hooks described this process of racial commodification as eating the other, the white fantasy of ripping out the other's beating heart to embody the mystified aspects of the other, and that is from their 2015 publication, page 31. Hooks speaks of the visual imagery that communicates otherness, often through magazines and travel booklets, where difference is commodified to promote consumption, wherein the other is both cannibalized and decontextualized. This process of decontextualization mystifies and generalizes the other, while simultaneously presenting narratives of diversity that appeal to the white fantasy of otherness. White fantasies of consumption also follow advertising methodology. Create a problem and sell the solution. Working with Bartkey's feminist analysis of biopower and beauty, where understandings of femininity are largely based on appearance in a heteropatriarchal society, Strings and Team's 2019 paper analyzes 40 years worth of yoga journal covers, outlining how yoga fits into technologies of white femininity. The feminine beauty regime is a common technology of femininity that forges a connection between discipline and desirability, in similar ways to vintage advertisements for washing machines and hairdryers, technologies that streamline the performance of expected femininity, taking for granted that these expectations were desired by women without coercion, and had somehow arisen separately from masculinity. Yoga has been co-opted into a technology of white femininity, fitting it into existing beauty regime narratives of perfecting the body by banishing fat as a method of discipline, reframing the submission of mind to body through misogynist ideas of good women as submissive. At the same time, to commodify yoga, it must be decontextualized. Strings and Team note that men and people of color are less visible on the covers, reinforcing the connection between yoga, youth, slimness, and white femininity, on page 334. The authors note that this reframing takes on a misogynist tone, pointing to the desired audience of white women to be white men, with a focus on images of slim white women in asanas to signal sexiness and sell products. Technologies, if we were to consider them as a tool, are to achieve a purpose within a set of constraints. And this begs the question, why would women use technologies to fit men's ideals unless there were no other options within systems of power but to placate? The reframing of yoga as a technology of white femininity not only seeks to eat the other, consuming yoga through products and images, but also strives to resolve this dissonance of self and other by creating a new dissonance as it's partially digested by white supremacist and misogynistic frameworks. Accusations of stealing culture are mediated through paradoxical rhetorics of self-love and consumer fixes, distracting from the liberation that is central to the practice of yoga by creating a yoga practice products complex that Strings and Team outline on page 341, where entrance is not spiritual but economic. The practice product complex ties inner peace to special clothes, guides, apps, and a constant consumption and discipline cycle to perfect a permanently imperfect body. A similar 2020 study by Wittich and McCartney follows the yoga journal covers from 1975 to 2020, focusing on the media representation from an obscure and exotic spiritual discipline imported from the mystical East to the young, white, and fit woman that they outline on page 32. Wittich and McCartney note that Yoga Journal acts as a conduit of perceived authenticity. The magazine's official website claims that it seeks to provide authoritative information and insights about yoga while making problematic and disprovable claims that decontextualize the history of yoga into a desirable spiritual monomyth that is both westernized and for Western consumption. An authority that encourages practicing holding a shape to create an emotional connection, whether a complex ballet evoking wonder in the audience or a downward dog in a fancy studio to seek internal peace, each conflates the external image with internal reality. As a technology of white femininity slotted into the contexts of imperialism and misogyny, this enforces conformity over diversity. There is a correct way to be, to pose, to move or not move, to seek and to find. Both of these studies discuss the lack of diversity. Wittich and McCartney note that the 70s onward were saturated with images of Indian men as authorities on yoga, while white women were its primary practitioners, on page 34. White women were depicted in athletic gear, visually represented as distant from the Indian origins of yoga, on page 35, in the process of depicting the Indian other. Contemporary covers further present the other as a commodity, depicting India as a tourist site, a vacation destination that held some wisdom, which could ultimately be brought home. Page 36. Edward Said's Orientalism outlines the supreme fictions of the West and Orient, neither of which have any ontological stability. Each is made up of human effort, partly affirmation, partly identification of the other. Preface, page 12. Within the power dynamics of imperialism, the Orient has helped to define Europe, or the West, as one of its deepest and most reoccurring images of the other. Page 1. Said points out how Europe, or the West, socially constructed and produced the Orient, controlling and managing an otherness through representations and appropriation. This was never a set of equals, but a fiction created by Europe as a contrast to itself in order to build its own self-image. This submissive partnership, as Said says on page 92, reflected racialized and misogynistic imperial imaginaries, creating an other to be both mystified and consumed, somehow elusive while submissive. Scholar Anne Anling Cheng's 2019 book, Ornamentalism, builds on Said's work, that the empire of signs outlined by Said can reproduce binaries, flattening the West and the Orient through masculine and feminine imaginaries, on page 90. In an interview about the book, Cheng noted that the West being the often masculine, imaginary, and intellectual subject contemplating the East, which was seen as a passive object that is often feminized. Paragraph 3. Examining the gendered aspects of imperialism offers a look into imperial imaginaries of gender, where the feminine, including the white feminine, racialized other, and othered feminine, is submissive, an object of voyeurism, and contemplated without a plural voice. While the visual fantasy sold through the white cooptation of yoga is from the lens of white men, the draw for white women, or queer people like myself, is not always the pants and fancy studios. The same process of commodification and consumption is echoed through all aspects of cultures of consumption. Selling the idea of submitting the mind to the body only makes sense within a larger context of mind and body being separate and having different values. Section 3. Alien Technologies in the Digital Age of Dissonance. I was brought to yoga on the advice of a therapist after I had expressed feeling a sense of distance from myself, a dissonance between my mind and body. Breathing and moving into shapes was sold to me as a fix for this, alongside medications and diagnoses about what my brain was doing to me. But that didn't make sense the more I thought about it. How could I create a rift inside of myself? Where would I have learned to do this? As I read more about critical disability studies, I realized that this feeling of dissociation was better described as alienation, a Marxist term for the individualist ideology under capitalism, which leaves people solely accountable for their fate and disorganized under the guise of autonomy. To examine what lies beneath technologies of whiteness and white femininity, we must also take a critical disability approach, as value-laden assumptions made onto bodies, where beauty, race, and pleasure are distilled into genetics, lie at the heart. A technology of perfecting the body assumes that there is a perfection that is not only universal, but also achievable. Enlightenment-era thinking, which relied on dualism and rational objectivity, sought to remove emotions from logic. White men were naturally logical, while women and people of color were emotional. This plays into the racist and misogynistic narratives of submission used to commodify yoga, but also has larger implications for mental health, as the mind and body are configured as separate. This binary is explored by Roberts' book from 2015, who connects the practice of psychology to commodification and neoliberal capitalism, all of which seek to individualize problems onto people, disavowing structural or environmental concerns or causes. If there's something wrong, then boiling everything down to genetics means that there is no need to change the environment. Any change required must take place in the people exposed to it. And that's from page 31. In the marketing of yoga as both fitness regime and therapeutic, the yoga practice product complex fits neatly into the logics of neoliberal capitalism, where the individual is responsible for their self-care through ongoing processes of commodification, sidestepping creating communities of care. When I started to learn about yoga, I was also beginning to recognize the widespread commodification of culture and individuals. And to cope with that, I was further sold commodified culture and individualism. In neoliberal conceptions of reality, the construction and maintenance of the individual is central. Roberts explains this connection between psychology and capitalism. For brand loyalty to take root and for people to erect a false and elevated sense of self-esteem centered on loyalty or attachment to the products they purchase and display or merely talk about, presupposes not only a deep sense of alienation, but also the prior existence of a sense of self, which, before it can be reconstituted in business-friendly terms, must first be systematically undermined, threatened, subdued, or demolished outright. Page 131. In an effort to mask my growing understandings of larger systems, yoga was sold to me as a way to feel better. The message from white male practitioners was that it was a practice that could connect my mind and body. My mind and my body. While the intention of reducing suffering may have been good, the ultimate expectation was that I would feel a sense of connection to myself, not to anyone else or the larger world. Discipline, consumption, and mental health were fused. To assume that consuming a culture will make me feel whole presumes that there's something I was missing within my culture that could be consumed, relying on the process of othering instead of the recognition that constant consumption and having to be consumable was what was separating me from the rest of the world. The alienation I experience reflects systems that create alienation to constantly sell a consumable cure, an unending process of self-creation that reproduces systems of control. The yoga practice product complex that was sold to me was calm, pretty, docile, and easily digestible, both replicating white femininity and repositioning the emotional experience of alienation as a personal failure of discipline. Disability scholar Tobin Siebers in 2008 speaks to the social harms of conflating alienation with personal or innate failure. The medical model lodges defect in the individual body and calls for individualized treatment. Medicalization has at least two unsettling effects as a result. It alienates the individual with a disability as a defective person, duplicating the history of discrimination and shame connected to disability in the social world. And it affects the ability of people with disabilities to organize politically. Since no two people with a disability apparently have the same problem, they have no basis for common complaint or political activism. Page 73. Roberts takes this further through the Marxist conception of mystification, where what is actually being done or what is taking place or being experienced is obscured behind a set of constructions which suggest something else entirely, on page 78. The systematically structured aloneness appears to serve the circular reasoning of capitalism, where deep rifts are created between the mind and body as the body is pulled into the machinery of production. This separation then creates a dissonance, which is individualized and located by psychologists in the mind, and then lifestyle fixes are sold back to bridge the gap. Taking an anti-capitalist approach to disability dispels the medical and moral models of disability, where being disabled is a result of bad genetics or a lack of discipline, and pulls the lens back to see the systems of control forming a doom spiral. Depression, anxiety, and burnout, for instance, are currently diagnosed and treated as individual responses to stressors, rationalizing individual interventions like medication and therapy. The rise in the diagnoses of all mental illnesses is often currently explained through an individualist lens. However, this myopic lens obscures the numbers game. When many people are experiencing something, as we see with depression, anxiety, and loneliness, it makes more sense to seek a systemic explanation for the problem. Attempting to understand this paradox, I began to recognize a central theme of dissonance, specifically cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance was introduced to social psychology by Leon Festinger's 1957 A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, describing how knowledge elements or information can be consonant, where they follow one another logically, or dissonant when they are in contradiction. Pages 2 and 3. Dissonance is uncomfortable, so Festinger postulates that people will avoid dissonance, even unconsciously, or attempt to reduce the dissonance by adding or changing information to manufacture a consonant framework. Current work on cognitive dissonance explores how people justify behaviors that are out of line with their morals, for instance, actions that indirectly harm others, which is pronounced in systemic issues like capitalism and colonialism. To be within a system that encourages actions that are incongruent with human life creates dissonance, which is brought back into consonance by the addition or warping of additional beliefs, such as the concept of the individual, which allows for seeing humans and the earth as resources to be exploited, where mental health is balanced through a cost-benefit analysis. Breaking a systemic issue down into individual bodies that can be solved through discipline and consumer habits leads to the paradox of individualism, where individuation requires a pre-individual or social state to individuate from. The individual cannot be divorced from their social context. The creation of the individual leads back into dissonance. Trans-individualism was popularized by Simondon, whose work has been translated, compiled, and elaborated upon recently by Combs in 2013. The paradoxical hypothesis echoes dialectic Enlightenment thinkers like Kierkegaard, who discussed the tension in creating absolutes, as an individual is only an individual within the context of community. Therefore, a pre-individual being is a requirement for the emergence of both the individual and psychosocial field, as Combs writes on page 55. In transgressing the limits of individual reason, we can see that our experience of existence is not simply inter-individual, as Combs argues, since this still requires the individual as a center point. There's a greater more than one that all existence belongs to. Trans-individualism offers an alternative to a bird's-eye view that divides. Existence is boundaried, but also able to transgress those boundaries, expanding our sense of self and offering a starting point to understanding our space and place, moving mental health problems out of the individual and into the socio-cultural sphere. While technologies, especially smartphones in recent years, are often vilified as the reason for increases in mental illness and distress, an extensive meta-analysis by Odgers and Jensen in 2020 for the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health finds that the actual correlation is negligible. Other studies have elaborated on smartphones and internet technologies as mutable. Their effect on mental health has more to do with what they are believed to accomplish. While they can distract people from being on task, which in itself may offer a capitalist critique of which tasks are meaningful, these technologies are also tools to meet our needs of connection, especially for queer, disabled, racialized, and rurally located people who may have fewer spaces to connect with others. Similar to the ties between psychology and capitalism, technologies are not neutral tools, but instead are intertwined with larger socio-political systems. The issue of technology isolating people is not the tool itself, but the larger system of alienation that the tool operates in. The tool attempts to bridge alienation through connection, but the methods of connection are built within the ethos and production cycle of an alienating system, so the gap is never fully bridged. Feminists, science, technology, and society scholars, such as Wagman and Parks in 2021, have outlined how human-machine relations reflect larger systems of control, like how Alexa and other virtual assistants are encoded with patriarchal labor expectations of service and subservience that reproduce misogynistic frameworks of human interaction. Technocrypt scholars like Hammerai and Fritsch in 2019 take this approach alongside the constant remolding required by those disabled by systems. That exclusion of certain body minds is an ongoing choice by systems of power and comes alongside medical and moral ideologies of wanting to change disabled bodies into a specific form of able-bodied that slots neatly into the machinery of capitalism. To apply this thinking of technologies specifically to technologies of white femininity and mental health, we have examined the larger systems that create dissonance and now turn our attention to the logics behind technologies that aim to sell consonance. Which tools are envisioned, and what do they aim to shape? Section 4. Spheres of Control. Technologies of Femininity and Racialization. While ideas of whiteness and femininity dominate the yoga practice product complex, Berger in 2018 explains how dominant ideas of Black bodies, including weight and body image, serve to other racialized bodies within the larger systems of beauty, race, consumerism, and health, as yoga practice increasingly connotes a particular lifestyle orientation that can be characterized as healthy, stylish, and affluent, on page 34. Berger conducts content analysis on an infamous ExoJane blog post from 2014 called "It Happened to Me. There are no Black people in my yoga classes, and I'm suddenly uncomfortable with it." The article by pseudonym Jen Karen, a white woman, describes the first Black woman she sees in her class, but never speaks to, as heavyset and angry, making assumptions about her emotional state as in despair, quoted on page 32. Karen returned home crying about how her studio promotes acceptance without following through, making assumptions about who the studio is for, and presumably sat down to write the article, recounting to frame herself with compassion. The racist stereotypes and white savior narratives were responded to through comments and blog posts pointing out the racism that is so simultaneously powerful and invisible, as a single Black person was cast as a token for every person of color within an imported and commercialized class, on page 38. Berger's textual analysis names the skinny white girl yoga culture, where media representations alongside unconscious racist assumptions undermine the notion of yoga as inclusive, on page 40. Karen's anguish, placement of blame on studios, and calls to the community through her post only make sense as additions to create consonance from the dissonance of consuming culture as a lifestyle. Instead of seeing and naming the racist socioeconomic roots that created the skinny white girl yoga culture, her sudden awareness of and the drive to publicly share her whiteness serve to reinforce otherness by merging size and racial issues into a single issue, as Berger states on page 43. When I went to find the original ExoJane article for more context, it had been wiped from the internet, and I was sent to Confessions of a Female Journalist, a 2021 article by Sarah Didham, who compared the article to others around the same time, noting the similarities in tell-all articles of white women approaching race and class consciousness, and how the white women who consumed these articles often vilified the writers. This first-person industrial complex sought out mostly white female writers to publicly share personal stories, often humiliating them and preemptively ending their careers in the process of commodifying the confessional, and driving traffic through outrage in an early version of rage bait content, as Didham states in paragraph 8. The yoga practice products complex and the first-person industrial complex both employ white women while also acting as disciplinary technologies. They're also doing something larger, connecting the disciplining of complexity to industrial management. Similar to the complexity of Balanchine's work requiring industrial mechanisms enacted on workers, or the complex car mechanism requiring mechanization, or the burgeoning sites requiring hot take tell-alls to gain reader traffic. These examples all illustrate that industry is not correlated with complexity. Instead, it appears that breaking down actions, people, and emotions into chunks that can be repeated, supervised, contained, and commodified constrains complexity, in the service of stereotypes and mononarratives. Stereotypes, monoliths, and mononarratives act as efficiencies, flattening people, culture, wants, and needs into simplistic and sellable products that use the fewest number of words or ideas. Efficiency and commercial viability are ideas projected onto products and people, who are then given specific methods to meet those goals. Commodification requires flattening, both of the consumer and the consumable. Products must be generalizable to a general public. Scholar Tara McPherson in 2012 approaches this method of chunking in Why Are the Digital Humanities So White?, which outlines the historical contiguity between internet technologies in America alongside civil rights movements. Binary categorizations of race, sex, and gender are coded into internet technologies, reflecting the systems of power that civil rights movements sought to change. To digitize information into a binary system requires breaking the complexity of life into binaries that fit the coding structure. This process extends from the assumption that a binary structure is inevitable or natural. In the same way, technologies of white femininity flatten the concepts of whiteness and femininity into a mononarrative that relies on binaries. There is a correct or expected way to be, and that implicitly excludes full expressions of humanity, while explicitly excluding people based on proximity to whiteness and assumed gender. Whiteness exists through the exclusion of people of color, just as the colonization of yoga as a technology of white femininity is tied to othering and commodification. This leads to the exclusion of racialized folks from yoga studios, while those same studios can present a spiritual, holistic, and multicultural image and ethos. By design, technologies of white femininity did not seek inclusion, but exclusion. Therefore, the dissonance of feeling disconnected, whether from self or others, is never bridged through its use, only made deeper, alongside the larger rifts created through its perpetuation of othering, commodification, and misogyny. Section 5. Posing, posting, positing, and policing. Deflections of consumption or bridging the rift. As the yoga practice product complex is aimed at disciplining the white feminine through racialized otherness, it has racism baked into it, whether it's implicit, such as the exorbitant cost of modern yoga studios and products, or explicit racist remarks. Ethnographer Rumia Pucha recounts the story of being kicked out of a yoga studio following what she perceived as a difficult conversation, but which the white woman had reported to a manager as an attack. A white peer had said "Namaste" together, and Pucha, in the first 2018 article, confided in her how it felt to see a meaningful, even reverent word in India reduced to a common commercialized joke. Paragraph 2. At her next visit, Rumia was intercepted by the manager who accused her of causing problems and asked her to find another studio. In a follow-up post, Pucha examines the white liberal woman's fascination with yoga. It performs a sense of virtue signaling which recenters whiteness, all while providing a deflecting shield against scrutiny under the logic of private spirituality. It's all the bragging rights of social justice without any of the humility or self-awareness. Paragraph 10. Above this quote, Pucha includes a picture of a slim white woman performing the dancer's pose in matching metallic athleisure, blonde hair in a bun. Pucha explores how this version of racism that focuses on the image redefines racism, where good white people, the well-traveled multicultural kind, perform progressive multicultural politics in public while continuing to harbor and even voice deeply disturbing prejudices and resentments in private. Paragraphs 9 and 10. The comment sections of Pucha's blog differ entirely from the ExoJane comment section. Women identify themselves as white, thanking Pucha for her analysis. These comments were often formatted into neat paragraphs, outlining their context, asking if it was okay for them to be white women and practice yoga. One comment stood out in particular. L. Lakshmi outlined that she had never considered yoga to be cultural appropriation before, had a spiritual middle name given by a monk, and asked, "Is there an okay way to tell my story with yoga and not align myself with these white women, even though I very definitely am one? What am I to do with this knowledge now?" Seriously asking. This was fascinating to me, thinking through this woman reading a testimony, logging in, then going down to the comments section to lay out her credentials and seriously ask how to continue to publicly do what she was being asked to stop. How to not be that kind of white woman. How serious could this ask really be? None of these comments had responses, and the comments section had been closed. I started to think through the narrative of this research that I'm currently reading. The existence of a yoga practice product complex, acting as a colonial technology of white femininity, reinforces this type of internal monitoring, where the racist and misogynistic gaze is internalized by the individual. These comments asked how they could still practice, go to their spaces, and still feel good about it. How could they engage with technologies without feeling bad? Not how they could dismantle the larger racist structures through anti-racism and intersectional feminism. Other comments, like one by Jennifer, stated, "I had already started accepting that yoga is completely inappropriate for white women like me to do. No matter how much work I do to be appreciative instead of appropriative, I'm still doing harm." Two themes began to emerge from self-proclaimed white commenters to either ask to be given permission to feel good about their practice or to publicly announce how they disengage entirely. Within the larger racial capitalist framework, I don't understand how either of these would be helpful or possible. Appreciation, like appropriation, is a reductive rhetoric, as Pucha explains, that still serves to invisibilize people of color and protect white comfort. To appreciate a culture tends to create a monolith or a generalization, which can also be consumptive, and within larger systems that prioritize profit, yoga is a commodity that can be sold as a technology of white femininity while bridging the dissonance through discourses of appreciation. When it becomes uncomfortable again, as seen in the comments section, some white women no longer want to consume. To me, this highlights the emotional quality that drives white women's uptake of yoga, that there was something promised besides fat burning, a seeking for spirituality that must be consumed. In my experience, it was what was promised with ballet and subsequently with mechanized labor. Get into the right shape and you will feel good. It points to the rift between the mind and body, self and other, and the order that demands one submit to the other. The binary must also be deconstructed to reveal the underlying differential power dynamic. The performance of white womanhood does not need to rely on a contrast to a racialized other, but current iterations of colonized yoga rely on the dual performances of white femininity and appreciation of a racialized other, resulting in consumption. Within the comments section, self-proclaimed white women ask how to create a difference, how to perform white womanhood differently from this other group of white women, seeking to divide the population up further, replicating the technologies of power. The women in the comment sections were asking what Puja had already addressed. Some practitioners seem to understand why the behavior I am identifying here is a problem, without the need to abandon yoga altogether, an outlook I wholeheartedly support. The problem with whiteness and/or white womanhood doesn't need to be a problem with yoga. Paragraph 19. To dismantle technologies of white femininity does not require removing yoga, ballet, or baristas. It requires rethinking our relationships of consumption in relation to these technologies, asking what it is that we are told these technologies offer us, and how to engage without harm or othering. In one of the last classes of my degree, a course on global feminism, the topic of yoga came up. A femme student who was a yoga teacher spoke of white women who had asked for the Sanskrit names for poses. Her response to patrons was more nuanced, but she summed it up for us as, "Shut up and breathe." This leads me to wonder what an intersectional feminist version of yoga could look like. How can spaces be decommodified? How can white women engage mindfully? What would this look like? I instead wonder why it has to look like anything, which implies a commodified lifestyle, either through products or taking pictures to post, an object or image to be viewed and perfected. Perhaps it is recognizing the poses as stretches instead of markers of politics, to recognize how things feel and where those feelings stem from, dismantling what Robin DiAngelo identified as white fragility in her 2020 book of the same name. To do so requires building up the psychosocial stamina of being in diverse community, widening the lens to include individuals and systems, and recognizing how systems structure and demand performance, critiquing managers who seek to see a certain dance or magazine cover. DiAngelo explains whiteness as a set of locations that are historically, socially, politically, and culturally produced, and which are intrinsically linked to dynamic relations of domination, on page 56. These relations of domination are not natural, and are kept invisible through appeals to nature. Whiteness is both reified and kept invisible, and Alexander's 2004 exploration of the performative sustainability of whiteness outlines how the performance of whiteness is a self-reifying practice, a practice that sustains the ability to name and conversely not to be named, on page 649. There's no whiteness to be found. It is shifting and denies being essentialized while it requires the essentializing of everything around it, attempting to deal with complexity through averages, chunks, and scientific management in order to gain a bird's eye view, to consume everything and be the one to name it all. Instead, writer Ibenemi Essay's 2021 preface to Decolonizing Yoga invites us to start from where we are. Breathing in, we honor our ancestors, those who came before us to impart their wisdom, love, and strength, nurturing us into existence. Breathing out, we feel into our sacred gifts. We remember our true selves and cultivate present moment awareness of our unity with the universe. Allow your body to settle into its innate knowledge that exists beyond language and theory. Paragraph 1. This knowledge that exists beyond language and theory points to the parts of knowledge that must be flattened, subjectified, and chunked in order to be communicable. Something that does not exist individually or even interindividually, but instead transcends those forms of communication. Section 6. Coda. What do we keep? Tying together and destruction. The coda of a piece, whether short story, ballet, or personal essay, is the concluding element. In a pas de deux, this often takes the form of parading the main dancers. In music, especially classical, the coda is a final flourish with its own character or themes, sometimes with a coda of its own, a codetta. As Farah in 1982 writes in a detailed examination of Swan Lake, there's a difference between music and dance, though they are often intertwined as forms of communication. Dance more often communicates through symbols rather than signs, where the actions of human dancers are loaded with meaning. Page 306. The meaning comes through a process of not simply watching the performance, but decoding why and how the movements were chosen, the emotion expressed or hidden, and the innate human connection between dancer and audience that transcends words. A good deal of the force comes from our awareness that the actions that make up the dance are modeled for us by creatures who experience the same gravity, same physical restraints, and so forth. Page 307. Where signs like words, music, and poses often take clear communicable forms, dance exists in the realm of symbols, requiring the integration of costume, facial expression, choice of movement, and more, all working together to communicate something larger than a single word or pose could simplify. As the coda often takes a different form to contextualize its previous parts, the coda section to this paper and its spoken form also serves to tie the strings of this project together, outlining the symbolism throughout before returning to stability. While I only specifically discuss trans-individualism in one piece that makes up this project, each piece connects to each other. While each piece can exist individually, their meaning is better understood through them as a whole. In this way, each individual piece is more than one. As well, since they are creative pieces, I was able to move between the internal and external, through thoughts and dialogue in commute and stability, and in the shifting lens of insta-poetry and science experiments. Every labyrinth was constructed serves as a cipher to these pieces, describing how walls are always built and maintained, whether it's the internal-external divide or self and community. Commute. As I grew up in Toronto, a city with accessible transit, I've only recently learned to drive. To work through my issues with driving, I learned about the history of car lobbying and divestment from public transit. I began plotting a short story to reframe how truly absurd our transportation reality is, as the Ford factory usage of Taylorist principles dovetailed with my interest in ballet and poses. In this piece, I explored speculative fiction as a way to create futures. This short story explores the nuances of a world where heavy investment was put into public transit, as we follow a character on her morning commute to work. This character, Ryla, reflects on our present through a lens of absurdity so that the reader can examine possibility out of the framework of the normal. Growing up on science fiction, I identified with Bellen Johnston's 2020 exploration of movie themes from the science fiction of 1980 to disaster movies of the early 2000s, speaking to the rise of disaster movies post 9/11, normalizing massive loss and reframing the idea of victory amid incentivized resistance to changing the status quo. Victory isn't getting something or achieving something better or reaching a goal. It's not dying. It's just surviving, as they state in their video at 1 hour 28 minutes. These doom and gloom narratives often reproduce neoliberal notions of individualism through their survivorship narratives where only a special few people can save us, and only some of us survive. As I seek to share research, I want to develop my skills in the emotive quality of my writing to make it more pleasurable and life-affirming to read and write. Stories about scarcity and technoscience, highly intertwined with the Silicon Valley neoliberal capitalist, as well as the imperial colonizing explorer narratives replicated and problematized in Star Trek, have been narrativized as tragedies, and narratives that normalize any amount of unnecessary death serve to uphold the status quo. Optimistic possibilities are necessary not only for our psychological health, but also our political health and continued existence. Some basis for unity is needed, and narratives must not only make the revolution irresistible, as Bambara stated, but also make the future aspirational. Public transportation is often a sci-fi shorthand for the future. In the 2023 publication Transit of the Future, McCormally notes that public transit is often science fiction shorthand for a society that has mastered problems of both physics and governance, in paragraph 2, noting Star Trek's vision of an egalitarian utopia in the San Francisco Air Tram, Isaac Asimov's moving walkways in caves of steel, and Ursula Le Guin's large-scale interplanetary transit in The Dispossessed. My story was directly inspired by the 1953 short story The Commuter by Philip K. Dick. The author, most known for his concept of androids dreaming electric sheep, wrote these anthropomorphizing stories about the juncture between technology and politics, where systems built with the intention of the few were somehow paramount and more human than the people not given a say in creation. The Commuter tells the story of Macon Heights, a town that isn't on the transit map because it almost existed, the victim of a compromise. 3 suburbs were proposed and lobbied against by merchants who feared business being taken out of the city. Instead of 3 suburbs, 2 were approved, excluding Macon Heights. When a commuter from Macon Heights attempts to buy a train pass, he argues with the ticket seller about his existence. Then the commuter is shown a map and immediately disappears. A detective, Payne, takes the train which stops at the idyllic town. He begins to panic as the existence of this town contradicts his bureaucratic knowledge. Payne plunges into existential horror and races home to find out that his life has possibly been altered. Analysis and adaptations of this story have made it clear that Payne has entered a new reality. He's not where he was before. But this story reads to me as coping with dissonance, how bureaucratic processes can beget life or disappearance, and how experiences outside the framework of the normal are recast as self-destroying horror. When confronted with the visual reality of the town, Payne doesn't believe it. It is only through the sense of touch and taste as he steals and eats a grape that he believes his experience of reality. My short story imagines an alternate future, where the social, economic, and political structures are set up to allow life to flourish. The air tram connects to Macon Heights, which did not suffer its fate of non-existence. I made a few specific choices, including a cast of characters we would currently call disabled, and not giving any characters screens. A common theme in science fiction is to approach disability with technological fixes, such as bionics and speech devices. Instead, I wondered what it would look like to use technology to adapt the world to people, reframing disability as a difference that matters, in the words of Crip technoscientists Hammerai and Fritsch. Therefore, the importance is not in perfecting bodies, but in creating better systems to suit an array of body-minds. We follow a character who uses a walker, where the platform and train meet in a way to facilitate onboarding, and the engineer's priority is to assist onboarding. We learn that ASL is taught in elementary schools, and later see characters communicating with the transit engineer. Disabilities do not become limits, but spaces for expansion. I also chose to write in the form of a pas de deux, a ballet in 5 acts. The entrée, where the characters or dancers greet one another. Adagio, the slow, graceful movement with the assistance of a partner. Variations, where each partner performs their solo, represented by consonant sections of internal and external dialogue. And the coda, which offers callbacks to the theme of the dance or story. Pas de deux is an interesting phrase when translated to English because pas can refer to step or pace, a step or pace of 2, but the phrase also follows the structure of the colloquial negative, not of 2, which pulls back to the larger themes of this project. Pas de deux is always performed by more than one. The singular dance only exists within the plurality of dancers. Lavery and Wybrow in 2012 explore this further. Pas de deux troubles binary understandings of sexuality and ontology. It exposes the fact that we are always and forever out of step. Page 1. To be a rhythmic or dissonant is not only a starting point, but is also part of the process of finding consonance. I considered creating a future that was so far beyond what we could expect that the reader would have to construct it around themselves. But I reconsidered, since the purpose of this was to show a path forward, not to throw readers off balance by keeping one foot in reality and jumping to the future. In terms of linguistics, we can also consider the use of pas as a form of negation. When I learned French as a child, to negate a verb took the form of ne verb pas, whereas current colloquial French uses verb pas, a single negation instead of a double. This is the result of a cycle identified by linguist Otto Jespersen in 1917, later named Jesperson's cycle. The cycle describes the way that new negations come to exist in language. It begins with both being used, and then the old one falls off. In this way, the story also takes the form of a step toward the future, a constant cycle of adding something new and letting the old fall off, as much as I wish it were a grand leap. Infinity. The irony of loneliness is that we all feel it at the same time, together. Carr, 2017. I had avoided poetry for a long time, but was brought back by a Pinterest post of Rupi Kaur's poetry. Kaur has been criticized for her use of contemporary words, Instagram-style communication, and absurdly, the accessibility of her work, where critics have conflated accessible poems with the open denigration of intellectual engagement and rejection of craft, criticizing its popularity as artless poetry. Kaur's form has been described as insta-poetry by Kiernan in 2021, using broad concepts over specific imagery and artwork that grabs attention. My first poem, named for Insta Poetry, describes 2 moments. The first is of seeking out connection on an app that wants you to stay on. Content delivered as a river that has been dammed off, a stream of content just for me, and the interruption of a notification. As well, it describes the moment that I first saw one of Carr's poems, how my finger hovered over the screen instead of scrolling. Instead of consuming more signs in the forms of images, some space opened up in my mind as a post asked me to think about its symbolism. Accessible poetry, or any media, that takes advantage of algorithmic norms to attempt to raise consciousness is important. Speaking about it as denigrating craft feels like saying that adding a ramp ruins the architecture of a building. Creating access does not remove craft. If anything, it increases craft, since craft is not a stable thing to be found in the world. It comes through the contribution of many. The motif of infinity through the pieces, especially Every Labyrinth Was Constructed, shows the layering and continuity of information, pushing against what McPherson identifies as the fragmenting of experience into communicable forms. Ian Allan Paul's 2022 work on the discipline of computation works with Deleuze and Kafka to explain how rationality has become focused on the infinitesimal, page 19. He elaborates on this during a discussion with the podcast Acid Horizon in 2022 that there are 2 kinds of infinity. In order to be digitized, infinity must be differentiated and categorized through infinite division. However, this process in turn highlights the opposite end of the spectrum, the uncomputable infinite sets of coordinates that they discuss at 33 minutes. The Blackout poem takes a part of this interview as its base, drawing lines over top some of the ideas to find something else inside. Science Experiments pulls from the memory of dying carnations. I wondered how snipping the ends of their stems and then filling them with color made the colors seem inevitable. Like how my journey through identity has involved pulling from imaginaries on either ends of the binary, or spectrum, to create something new. But this process also serves to make the structure seem inevitable. It's not that the carnation wants the dye, or that the children yearn for gender roles, but each is placed within them and tasked with survival. Then their uptake acts as justification for the naturalness of the structure through appeals to nature. It is only through understanding the baths that we're placed in and being given the autonomy to choose that I've been able to seek out something new. Codetta, metastability, ending at the beginning. I originally pitched this autoethnographic essay portion to include a performance art piece captured through photographs showing a time-lapse over 4 months learning the dancer's pose, a yoga pose with a similar but distinct form to a ballet arabesque. I created this art piece first. As I wrote the accompanying essay, I realized that including this piece would be replicating the issues that I was discussing. While I had intended the dancer's pose to bridge between ballet and yoga, I had not examined the appropriation and commodification of that connection. My intention was to show how the act of holding a pose doesn't make someone more flexible. It reinforces rigidity. In the same way, the mechanization of dancers and workers and technologies of white femininity constrain flexibility, trading it for perfection in a specific way of being. Further analysis, especially the ethnographic work of Rumia Pucha, encouraged me to destroy this piece as a way to end this essay, which had been inspired by 2 pieces of lost media, a codetta that added a final twist to the coda. The destruction of this piece also tied into document discussions with Dr. Jeppesen about using capital letters or proper nouns for race. While I do not capitalize whiteness, many of the authors that I quote do, so I included a preface outlining my approach. Instead of erasing whiteness, I aim to decenter it through the process of recentering blackness and otherness, which are created through the process of centering and reproducing whiteness. By destroying this art piece instead of pretending that it never existed and excluding it, I engage in the process of centering my complicity and knowledge of these systems of harm in an effort to decenter these systems and envision new methods of relating that do not rely on appropriation. Therefore, the final image of this collection exists in the same space as the flattened form of white femininity that technologies seek to create, flattened forms of existence that our knowledge systems reproduce, and flattened relations that scientific management practices instill. It exists in non-existence, made real through incentivized performance. It will only ever link back to how I remember it and describe it to you.